Time to start talking about our last severe storm, which is a hurricane. A hurricane is a low-pressure system, just like a tornado, which again is something that you should be able to just know, because you know that low-pressure systems have bad weather, severe stormy weather, because of that rising air leading to the cloud formation. So because they are a low-pressure system, they are also spinning counterclockwise. In order to be considered a hurricane, the winds must be spinning at least 73 miles per hour. Now, actually, in other parts of the world in science, you'd use kilometers, but here in the U.S., if you ever hear about hurricanes on the news, you're going to be looking at it in miles per hour. So 73 miles per hour. In the U.S., we call them a hurricane. Pacific is a typhoon, Indian Ocean, cyclone. So they do have different names depending where you are located, but they are still all a giant storm, and they are considered to be one of the most powerful storms on the earth. And so you can think about, why would it be considered the most powerful storm on the earth? We talked about tornadoes, and you saw some of the destruction that they could do. Well, hurricanes are much larger. If you notice over here, this hurricane, it's right next to the state of Florida. And so this hurricane is the same size as the state of Florida. If you look at it from this side of the clouds to this side of the clouds, it's the same length as an entire state, if not bigger, and it is much wider than the state of Florida. So because of just how massive that storm is, it's going to be the most powerful storm. It also is going to last a lot longer than a tornado. So a tornado could come and could last for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Your hurricane, we track these out from, weeks out in advance. So they are going to come and stick around. They're going to move much slower. You're going to be affected by that hurricane if it's passing you for at least a day, if not two. So hurricanes can be extremely devastating. And some of you may have seen some of the devastation that a hurricane can cause. The one good thing is, unlike a tornado, we actually have warning for a hurricane. We know when it's forming. We know when one might form. We know exactly how it forms. We can estimate the path that it will follow. And we can put the timeline of when it can hit us. So we do have a lot of warning for these storms, which are good because that gives us time to evacuate if need be. So let's keep on going and learn more about hurricanes. So hurricanes form typically between your 5 and 20 latitude degree lines on the earth. And so why is that? Well, remember, the equator is 0 degrees latitude, and the equator is going to be very warm because of its direct sunlight. Hurricanes are fueled by warm water and warm air. Because they are fueled by warm water and warm air, that's why most of them occur or form within the 5 to 20 latitude line. Because since it's near the equator, it is going to be much warmer. So it has the warmth of the water that it needs. Hurricane season is June 1st to November 30th. The reason it's kind of late summer and then all the way into fall is because hurricanes takes a long time to heat and cool. Remember, water takes a long time to change temperatures. So that water typically isn't warm enough to form a hurricane until June. And it doesn't cool off until after November 30th. So because it holds its heat for so long, it can still form a hurricane late into the fall. So remember, the warm water and warm air is what is fueling it, and that air is rising, and that's the rising air within the eye of the storm, and then it goes out and it spins in a counterclockwise direction. So that is your hurricane. Parts of a hurricane. There are 3 main parts for your hurricane. You have the eye of the storm. So this is part 1. The eye of the storm is the warmest and the calmest part of the storm. Most people don't really care that it's the warmest, but what is significant is that it is very calm. I've never been in the eye of a hurricane, but if you are in the eye of a hurricane, that means you've had horrible weather, and then all of a sudden, everything is just eerily quiet. And then eventually you're going to get horrible weather again. Because to get to the eye of a hurricane, you have to first pass through the eye wall. So the eye of the hurricane is the dead center, and then the eye wall is everything that is surrounding it. So that would be the eye wall. The eye wall is the worst part of the storm. It's the strongest part. So it has the strongest winds and the most rain. And so I always have students who are like, well, I want to be in the eye of the hurricane. Well, for you to get to the eye of the hurricane, that means the eye wall had to have passed over you, and then it's going to pass over you again. So you had to go through two parts of the worst parts of the storm just to get to the eye. So if you think about it that way, you probably don't want to be in the eye of a hurricane. You probably just don't want to be in the path of a hurricane whatsoever. So that's your eye wall. And then you have your spiral rain bands. The spiral rain bands are these parts coming out right here. If you think about astronomy, our spiral not solar systems, galaxies, it may make you think of that. But the spiral rain bands are those long stretches of clouds that come out. And they're just rain bands. That's pretty much all it is. Just clouds of rain, or connected clouds of rainstorms. So if there is a hurricane that is towards the upper end of Florida or Georgia or South Carolina and around that area, it is very likely that we have rain from that hurricane already, because those spiral rain bands can just cross states since these storms are so large. And so that was the third part of the storm. So eye, calmest, eye wall, worst. Spiral rain bands are just your rain clouds that extend, excuse me, I'm tired, that extend out from the storm itself. So let's continue on. Clear the screen. Okay. Here's how your hurricane forms. So most people don't know this, but your hurricane actually starts out as a thunderstorm in the middle of the ocean. So as a thunderstorm is occurring, you're getting, the warm air that's rising, and it's creating more storms. So once there is a cluster of thunderstorms in the ocean, meteorologists keep an eye on it. Okay, now there's always thunderstorms going on, everywhere. But in the ocean, if you've got like a few clusters of the storms that kind of come together, that's what gets meteorologists' attention. And so they will look at that. And if those thunderstorms start to spin, it becomes a tropical depression. And now we're really keeping an eye on it. If the winds pick up speed, and usually the winds will pick up speed if that water is warm or if it passes over a patch of warm water, it becomes a tropical storm. By now, we have named that storm, and we are all keeping an eye on it because we want to know if it's going to turn into a hurricane. If that storm then picks up even more speed and is going at least 73 miles per hour, it is now a hurricane. And then that hurricane may create or may make landfall, which then you really have to be watching. Typically, if you're going to get any increase in strength in one of these storms, it is specifically because that storm has passed over a patch of really warm water, because that's just like adding gasoline to a fire. It just makes it go. So that's how your hurricane forms. When your hurricane does make landfall, it creates what we call a storm surge. A storm surge is just a dome of water that goes up on the coast that the hurricane brings with it. It's some people kind of think of it as like a mini tsunami. I think a more accurate way to think about that is as a very, very high tide. So when you have if you're at the beach and high tide comes in, then you have the water all moving towards the shore, and it's moving up, and it's making the area right around you much deeper. That's what your storm surge is, but to an extreme. Your storm surge can be as tall as your house is. Or as deep as your house is. So that obviously is very, very bad. You will get a storm surge, obviously right where the hurricane makes landfall on the beach. But remember, all water is connected. So your rivers and lakes and everything that feeds into the ocean, it creates a storm surge there. So if we know that a hurricane is going to make landfall towards Wilmington, we are still going to look at what is the storm surge going to be on the Tar River, because the Tar River ultimately is going to feed into the ocean. So if the hurricane is pushing water up one of the rivers, and the ocean, then it's going to push it up further because everything is connected. So depending on the category of your, of your hurricane, is going to depend on the size of your storm surge. So the only thing you need to write down here is that your hurricanes are categorized based on wind speed. Remember, tornadoes are categorized based on the damage done. Now here we are just looking at wind speed. So if you have a category 1, again, you're over 73 miles an hour. So here it's 74 to 95. And your storm surge is about 4 to 5 feet tall. Now, I know I'm not standing in the room with you, but I'm about 5'1". So that would be, I know most of you have at least seen me. So that would be a storm surge that is my height. A category 2 is going to be 96 to 110 miles per hour, and the storm surge is 6 to 8 feet tall. Category 3 winds up to 130, and the storm surge is 9 to 12 feet tall, so taller than our ceilings. A category 4 is going to be wind speed 131 to 155 with 13 to 18 feet storm surge. That is absolutely crazy. Most of the time, a first-story building is going to be 10 feet tall. So this is about a 2-story like apartment building you could imagine. Just in that initial flooding, not even looking at the rain the hurricane's going to bring. Cat 5 is anything over 155 miles per hour, and the storm surges can be over 18 feet tall or deep, which is just absolutely horrible. But that's kind of an idea of your scale. Now, the other year, my husband is friends with Matt Engelbrett, and so when they grew up together, and there's a hurricane coming, and I was nervous because my family, my mom and sister, have moved towards the beach, and since they do live more towards the coast, I was concerned because I didn't know how bad the hurricane would be, and I was asking him, and I think at that time it was supposed to be category 3, and what he told me is category doesn't matter. In a way, it does matter, but he said when you are looking at how devastating a hurricane is going to be towards an area, the category doesn't make that big of a difference. Hurricane Matthew in Greenville had so much flooding. I want to say that hurricane was a category 2, and yet it did a lot of damage to everybody in this area, and our schools were closed for a week. And yet we had a category 3 or 4 or something not too long ago, and that did nothing towards the area. So you can't just look at a low category and assume there will be no damage. A lot of the damage for the hurricane is going to be dependent on the amount of rain that's within it. And the rain is not on this scale. So that's why he was saying you can't just look at categories. You have to look at the actual rain amount that hurricane is bringing. One year there was a hurricane, it was I think in October of last year. They were saying if this hurricane follows this path, it will do like no damage to Greenville. If it follows this other path, it will cause devastating flooding. And that was because that hurricane was stalled out in the mountains and it had just a massive amount of rain within it. And it would have poured all that rain into our watershed, and all that rain would have came to Greenville and flooded us out. And it probably would have been some of the worst flooding Greenville had seen in years. So thankfully that didn't happen. But again, that was a low category storm. It just had high amounts of rain. So as you keep that in mind, just think about that. Take all hurricanes seriously if they're telling you it could cause flooding, even if it is a lower category. Most hurricane deaths are caused by drowning because of the water, not by the wind itself. But still, don't go outside in 155 mile per hour winds. It's not going to be good for you. This is a screenshot that I took of a hurricane, the last hurricane as they were looking for at it coming towards us. And I did want to point something out. This cone that they talk about on the Weather Channel right here, this is what we call the cone of uncertainty. So the hurricane itself is bigger than this entire cone. Because remember, the hurricane is probably going to be larger than the state of Florida. Where the little red 3 and where the little red 1 is, that's just showing you where the eye of the storm. But the actual width of the storm is much, much larger than that. So anyway, they say that it can go anywhere within this cone of uncertainty. So it's basically a line of best fit. So they have the hurricane, in this case, going down the straight path in the middle. That would be your line of best fit. But what meteorologists are also saying is it could go anywhere within this cone. So it could go, on the very, very bottom part of Florida. Or it could miss Florida altogether and come up here towards Charleston. So your cone of uncertainty is just saying it could go within this zone. It's not saying it's definitely going to follow that central path. That's why because if you extended this cone further out, it would get more and more narrow. The more days you are away from hurricanes making landfall or whatever it is, the larger the cone gets because the more uncertainty there is. They have better prediction the sooner in time rather than later in time. But I did want to point that out because most people don't know that about the cone of uncertainty. So hurricane watch and a hurricane warning. Hurricane watch, just like a tornado watch, it's kind of like watch out for hurricane-related things. In a tornado watch, you're saying watch out because there might be a tornado. Here, you're saying you're going to see hurricane-related hazards within 48 hours. So within 48 hours, you're going to start to have some really heavy winds and some rain. Hurricane warning, that means you're going to see hurricane conditions within 36 hours. So this is talking about winds of at least 73 miles per hour and even more rain. So with your watch and your warning, notice it is very, very different than a tornado's because you have so much more warning. Even if it's a hurricane warning and you're in the hurricane-related hazards, you still have time to evacuate. You still have time to get away. You still have a couple days that you can make a move. So that's kind of your difference with the hurricane watch and warning. The scary thing with tornadoes is the lack of warning for them. The scary thing about hurricanes is just the powerfulness of them, as we all saw with the Bahamas for this last hurricane. But at least you do have warning to prepare. So that's kind of the benefit. So that is all for your hurricane watch and hurricane warning, and we will continue on. So one thing you can do to help protect yourself against a hurricane and just against flooding in general, because we all know, come on, Greenville's going to flood even if we get a heavy rain, let alone a hurricane. But to protect against flooding, areas will build what we call a levee. Everybody say levee. So a levee is simply an embankment that is built to help the overflow of a river. So I want you to picture a bathtub. What limits how much water that bathtub can hold is how tall the sides of the tub are. If you want to increase the capacity of the tub and allow the tub to hold more water, then what you have to do is build the sides of the tub wall up so that they are higher. And that's what a levee does. So if this red line I'm drawing is where the normal ground of where the river would stop, then what a levee is going to do is just build up that even taller. So sometimes it may be like cement or stone where it's the actual like wall, and they're building it along the side of a river to make it taller so that way the river can hold more water. Or sometimes it can even be a natural one and it's mounds of dirt and clay and stone that form over time. But you do need to know this definition. We're actually just about to do a lab, so don't worry, I'm about to stop talking. Y'all are going to do a lab here in a few minutes, and it's going to be about making a levee. So you need to know what a levee is. So I'm going to clear the screen, and I'm going to show you some pictures of a levee, because maybe if it's not, if you're having trouble understanding it, seeing an example will help. So here's a few different levees. The levee up here is just like a slight wall, and you can tell if the river goes up, it will allow it to rise higher than it would have before it floods neighborhoods. The one down here is just a wall. So again, this river could flood all the way up to here before that wall allowed the water to go into the surrounding neighborhood. This is a levee that it kind of looks more like a jetty that's shooting out. Who knows how far that goes. And then here you have one, and it's less of a wall structure, but you still have the stones and the plascement and embankments set around it. And they're just monitoring it to see if there needs to be any maintenance done. So those are your levees, just a couple examples of them. So Hurricane Katrina, you don't need to write this down. This is simply the intro into the lab that we are about to do. Now, I don't know if y'all would have been alive when Hurricane Katrina hit. I remember when it hit, one of my friends had actually just moved to New Orleans. But Hurricane Katrina is most known because of the devastating impact it had on New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina was simply a Category 3, and yet it did some of the most devastating damage that we have ever seen. It's considered to be one of the worst storms in U.S. history because of the amount of people it killed and the amount of damage it did. But the reason Hurricane Katrina was so bad, because it shouldn't have been as bad as it was because 50 levees failed. So remember, we just said levees are something that prevent flooding. Well, I don't know what you know about New Orleans, but New Orleans is below sea level. They are basically like a bowl sitting in the country. So water wants to all flow to the lowest point. So water naturally is going to want to flow and flood into New Orleans. So New Orleans has a ton of levees all around it to help prevent this flooding. Well, 50 of those levees broke and they let in all the water. And so just like New Orleans is a bowl, it filled up the city. And that's why it killed over 1,000 people and caused so much damage. At first, everybody thought New Orleans was going to be okay because no one knew the levee would break. And then once the levee started breaking, it was way too late by that point. But that's when everything was bad. And 80% of that city flooded. People were left on interstates for days. I want you to imagine you just had a flood. You got rescued from your home. You've lost everything you have. And a boat comes and picks you up, and the only place they can take you that's dry is one of those high interstates, like one of those bridges you drive over. And so they have to drop you off on that road or in a crowded arena. And imagine you're there for days. People are trying to get food and water to you, but the area is so flooded, it's impossible to get to you. You're surrounded by strangers. Some of you are sleeping outside. Just absolutely horrible. You look around, you see the flooding. People even saw like bodies floating in the water below them. It was absolutely horrible. And people would just wait for a bus that could take them somewhere else. And again, that was really hard to make any rescues because, well, one, the hurricane was still going on elsewhere, not there anymore. Now it's really sunny and hot. But the hurricane was still going on other places and the areas was still flooded. So that's just a couple things about Hurricane Katrina. And there's my email again. I hate it when it does that. Okay, a couple more fun facts about Hurricane Katrina. It permanently displaced about 400,000 people because they lost their houses and couldn't go back because it was that much damage. September 1st, 30,000 people were seeking shelter in the Superdome. So imagine that's like the Superdome is a lot bigger than the Greenville Convention Center, but it's an arena it's a football arena. So they had 30,000 people in that football arena and then 25,000 in the convention center right next to them. Now, there were shortages of food in that area. It was really, really hot. People were just sleeping in the seats. So think about a stadium seat. Imagine you just sleeping there. People were using the bathroom where they sat, which is absolutely disgusting. So there was a lot of bacteria. And also, never ever swim in flood water because flood water is also carrying the sewage with it. So don't go like, oh, look, my yard's flooded, I have a swimming pool. No, you have sewage water and all sorts of who knows what else in that water. Don't go swim in it. So you also had a lot of bacteria that was in the water, creating a public health emergency. That's about 1,200 deaths were just from the bacteria that was carried around from that storm. So here's a picture of New Orleans, and those are rooftops. So just to show you the amount of flooding, it was all the way up to people's roofs. The middle picture is a aerial picture of the city, and again, all you see are roofs. The top picture just shows you people trying to grab anything that can float to help them get through floodwater. And the bottom picture shows you a bunch of people all trying to ram onto one of those buses to leave the convention center and the Superdome in the aftermath of the hurricane. So I have a video that I'm going to show you. It has to do with Hurricane Katrina. So in just a moment, we will pause the video or we'll end the video so you can switch over to that one. And then when you're done with that, we are going to actually build a levee. And so you're going to be set up in groups and you are going to have a fun project. So I will explain that later, but for now, let's check out the video of New Orleans.